Don't talk to her. She's just background. The words landed without effort, casual, careless, like they belonged in a room where power spoke louder than people, and Ethan Caldwell didn't even glance up as he said it, his pen gliding across a contract worth $100 million while the skyline of Manhattan stretched behind him in glass and gold. The table filled with executives, lawyers, investors, all dressed in quiet authority, all watching the deal unfold like it was already won, and moving between them, unnoticed, was Naomi Brooks, her steps steady, her posture straight, her presence almost invisible by design, refilling water, adjusting plates, clearing silence no one else could hear. She had learned long ago that in rooms like this, being unseen was safer, easier, expected, but invisibility had a cost, because when no one looks at you, they forget you can see everything. And Naomi saw everything. She saw the way Ethan never acknowledged her, the way he spoke over her like air, the way his confidence filled the room like it couldn't be questioned. But she also saw something else, something small, buried in numbers and signatures and polished smiles, something no one else had caught. Not the lawyers flipping pages, not the investors nodding along, not even the man who built his empire on precision and control, because right there, between line items and projections, was a mistake, a single number, subtle but fatal, the kind that doesn't make noise until it's too late. And for a moment, Naomi paused, her hand hovering over a glass, her breath slowing just enough to think, because this wasn't her place, this wasn't her table, and people like her weren't supposed to interrupt people like him. She knew the rules: don't speak unless spoken to, don't cross lines you didn't draw, don't make yourself visible in a world that profits from ignoring you. But then again, she also knew something else, that silence, in the wrong moment, can cost more than speaking ever could. Across the table, Ethan leaned back, slightly, satisfied, confident, already moving on to what came next, unaware that the deal he was about to close wasn't just flawed, it was dangerous. And Naomi looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time that night, not as a customer, not as a man in a suit, but as someone standing on the edge of a mistake he didn't even see coming. And in that quiet second, between what was expected and what was right, something shifted, not in the room, not in the deal, but in her. Because sometimes the people you ignore the most are the only ones who can see the truth. And what Ethan Caldwell didn't know, not yet, was that the one person he refused to notice was the only one who could stop everything from falling apart. Naomi did not move right away, and that was what made the moment stretch, not loudly, not dramatically, but just enough for the air to feel different, like something unseen had shifted direction. Her eyes moved once more across the page in Ethan's hand, confirming what she already knew. The decimal was off, small, almost invisible, but in a deal this size, a fraction could mean millions, and millions could mean collapse. Across the table, one of the attorneys was already speaking, confident, rehearsed, explaining projections that depended entirely on that flawed number, and Ethan nodded slightly, not fully listening, because men like him did not expect mistakes, they expected results. Naomi felt the weight of the tray in her hand, the quiet expectation that she would step back, disappear, continue serving without ever becoming part of the room. That was the role. That was the agreement no one ever said out loud. And for a second, she almost followed it, almost turned away, almost chose silence. But then she remembered something else, the long nights studying numbers that used to make sense to her, the lectures she could no longer afford, the professors who once told her she had a gift for seeing patterns others missed. She remembered what it felt like to be seen, and how quickly the world had taken that away, and something in her refused to let that moment pass, not because she wanted recognition, not because she needed approval, but because the truth was sitting right there, waiting for someone to say it, and no one else was going to. Her steps were quiet as she moved closer, careful, measured, not interrupting, just existing a little more than before. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, it did not demand attention. It simply entered the room, calm and clear. "Sir, you might want to review the figure on page 14. The words were soft, but they did something louder than shouting ever could. They stopped everything. The attorney paused mid-sentence. A pen froze above paper. Someone shifted in their chair, and Ethan finally looked up, not fully, not yet, just enough to register that something had broken his rhythm. His expression tightened slightly. Not anger, not confusion, just irritation at being interrupted by someone he had already decided did not matter. "Excuse me," he said. The word clipped, controlled, but Naomi did not step back. She did not shrink. She simply held her ground, not challenging, not apologizing, just present. "The projected revenue multiplier," she continued, steady. "It does not match the supporting data." Now the room leaned in, not toward her, but toward the possibility that something was wrong. Pages began to turn, quickly at first, then faster. The quiet confidence that had filled the room moments ago started to thin, replaced by something sharper, something uncertain. One of the junior analysts spoke under his breath, then louder, pointing at the same line Naomi had seen, the same number no one else had questioned. And suddenly the conversation was no longer controlled. It was reacting, adjusting, unraveling in real time. Ethan's eyes moved down to the page, then back again, this time fully, this time directly at her. And for the first time that night, he was not looking through Naomi Brooks. He was looking at her, really looking, as if trying to understand how someone he had dismissed so easily could now be standing at the center of everything he thought he had under control. And in that moment, the power in the room did not disappear. It shifted, quietly, unmistakably, because the person who had been invisible just seconds ago had become the one person no one could ignore. For a moment, no one spoke, and that silence said more than any apology ever could. Because in rooms like this, silence only comes when certainty disappears. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the document as his eyes traced the numbers again, slower this time, more carefully, as if the page had changed since the last second he looked at it. But it had not changed. He had. Across the table, the lead attorney cleared his throat, trying to regain control, trying to stitch confidence back into a room that was already unraveling. "It is likely just a formatting oversight," he said, but his voice no longer carried the same weight, because now everyone was looking at the same line, the same detail, the same quiet fracture Naomi had pointed out. One of the investors leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, his expression shifting from passive agreement to sharp calculation, because now it was no longer about presentation, it was about risk. And risk had a way of exposing truth faster than pride ever could. Ethan flipped the page back, then forward again, comparing figures, cross-checking assumptions, and the more he looked, the clearer it became. The multiplier was wrong, not slightly, not insignificantly, but enough to distort the entire projection, enough to turn confidence into liability, enough to cost more than money. It could cost reputation, leverage, control, the very things he built his world on. The attorney spoke again, faster now, offering adjustments, explanations, alternatives, but the rhythm was gone, replaced by urgency, by the quiet awareness that something had slipped through, something that should have been caught, and yet was not by the team, not by the analysts, not by him. And that realization landed heavier than any number ever could, because Ethan Caldwell did not lose control, he prevented it. That was who he was, that was the image, the discipline, the reason people trusted him with decisions measured in millions. And now, in the center of that image, stood a truth he could not ignore. The only person who saw the flaw was the one he chose not to see at all. His gaze lifted again, this time fully steady, fully present, landing on Naomi without hesitation, without dismissal, studying her not as background, not as service, but as someone who had just altered the direction of everything in the room. And Naomi did not look away. She did not lower her eyes or retreat into the quiet space she had occupied before. She simply stood there, composed, grounded, as if she had always belonged in that exact moment. Even if no one else had noticed until now, around them the conversation continued, numbers being recalculated, clauses being reconsidered, the deal no longer smooth, no longer certain. But Naomi was no longer part of the background noise. She had become the pivot, the point where everything shifted, and Ethan felt it. Not just the mistake, not just the correction, but the realization beneath it. That power without awareness was fragile, that control without attention was incomplete, and that sometimes the difference between success and failure does not come from the loudest voice in the room, but from the quiet one no one bothered to hear. And as the room adjusted, recalibrated, tried to move forward, Ethan Caldwell remained still for just a second longer, looking at Naomi Brooks as if seeing her for the first time, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that ignoring someone does not make them insignificant, it only makes you blind. The room did not return to what it was, not fully, not even close, because once doubt enters a place built on certainty, it does not leave quietly. It lingers, it reshapes every word, every glance, every decision that follows. The attorneys were now speaking in lower tones, more cautious, more precise, double-checking numbers they had already approved minutes ago. Investors leaned back instead of forward, their confidence replaced with calculation, because trust, once shaken, does not rebuild. In the same moment it breaks, and Ethan Caldwell felt that shift more than anyone. Not because he was losing the deal, not yet, but because for the first time that evening, he was no longer the one controlling the pace. He was reacting, adjusting, recalibrating in real time. And that was not where he operated best. His strength had always been anticipation, seeing problems before they formed, eliminating risk before it could surface. But this time, the risk had already been there, sitting quietly in plain sight. And he had missed it, not because he lacked the ability, but because he lacked the attention, and that distinction settled into him heavier than the numbers on the page. Across from him, one of the senior partners closed the folder slowly, his expression unreadable but no longer impressed. "We will need to revisit the projections," he said, calm but firm. And that one sentence carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, because it meant delay, it meant hesitation, it meant the deal was no longer certain, and certainty was the currency Ethan valued most. The conversation shifted again, now filled with contingencies, revised timelines, careful language that replaced bold promises. And while the room continued to move forward, it was no longer moving with him. It was moving around the problem, around the mistake, around the gap that had just been exposed. And in the middle of it all stood Naomi Brooks, no longer invisible, no longer part of the background rhythm, but not part of the table either. She had stepped into the moment only long enough to change it, and now she stood quietly again, tray in hand, composed as if nothing had happened, as if she had not just altered the direction of a deal measured in millions of dollars. Because for her, this was not about recognition. It never had been. It was about truth. About the simple refusal to let something wrong pass just because it was easier to stay silent. Ethan noticed that, not just what she did, but how she carried it. There was no urgency in her, no need to prove, no demand for acknowledgement, and that unsettled him more than the mistake itself, because power he understood, ambition he respected, but quiet certainty, the kind that does not ask to be seen, that was different. That was something he had not accounted for. His fingers tapped lightly against the table once, a small movement, almost unnoticeable, but for him it was a signal, a reset, a decision forming beneath the surface. He closed the document slowly, not in frustration, not in defeat, but in recognition that this moment was no longer about salvaging a deal. It was about understanding what had just happened and why. His eyes lifted again, finding Naomi across the room, not as an afterthought, not as a background presence, but as the variable he had overlooked. And in that quiet exchange, without a single word spoken, something shifted again, not in the room, not in the deal, but in him, because for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell was not thinking about numbers, or contracts, or outcomes. He was thinking about a person he had chosen not to see, and realizing that the cost of that choice had almost been everything. The meeting did not end with a signature. It ended with hesitation, and in Ethan Caldwell's world, hesitation was louder than failure, because failure could be explained, controlled, even reframed, but hesitation meant doubt, and doubt spread faster than any mistake ever could. The folders closed one by one, slower than before, conversations shifting into careful tones, promises replaced with phrases like, "We will review," and "We will follow up." And just like that, what was supposed to be a decisive moment became something unfinished, something uncertain, something Ethan could not fully command. He stood from his chair with the same composure he always carried, shoulders straight, expression neutral, but inside, something was unsettled, not chaotic, not emotional, just off, like a calculation that no longer balanced the way it should. Across the room, Naomi Brooks moved again, back into the rhythm she knew, collecting glasses, clearing plates, returning to a role that asked her to exist without being noticed. And for a brief moment, it almost looked like nothing had changed, like the room had reset itself, like power had quietly taken its place again. But Ethan knew better, because once you see what you missed, you cannot unsee it. And he had missed her completely, not just her presence, but her value, her awareness, her ability to catch what an entire team of professionals overlooked. And that realization did not sit comfortably with him. It pressed against everything he believed about control and competence, about who matters in a room and who does not. He watched her for a second longer than necessary, noticing the way she moved with precision, the way her attention never scattered, the way she observed without inserting herself unless it mattered. And that detail stayed with him, because it was not loud. It was not impressive in the way his world usually defined impressive, but it was effective, and effectiveness was something he respected above all else. One of his associates approached him, speaking quietly about next steps, about renegotiation, about how to recover the deal, and Ethan responded, nodding, giving direction, regaining structure in his tone, but his focus was split, part of him still anchored to the moment that had just passed, to the voice that had interrupted everything without force, without ego, just clarity. And that contrast lingered, because in a room full of people trying to prove their value, the one person who had proven it the most had not tried at all. She had simply acted when it mattered, and then stepped back, as if the outcome was enough, as if recognition was optional, and that unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. As the final guests began to leave, the room slowly returning to its polished silence, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his mind moving through the sequence again, not the mistake itself, but the path that led to it, the overlooked detail, the ignored presence, the assumption that had shaped his behavior before the meeting even began. And for the first time in a long time, he questioned it, not out loud, not dramatically, just internally, quietly, the way real shifts begin, because power, he realized, was not just about being heard. It was about knowing who to listen to, and tonight, he had listened too late. His gaze found Naomi again as she placed the final glass onto a tray, her expression unchanged, her focus steady, already moving on, and something about that final image stayed with him, not as a conclusion, but as a beginning, because Ethan Caldwell was not the kind of man who ignored lessons, especially the ones that almost cost him everything. And as he took a step forward, not toward the exit, but toward her, one thing was already clear: this moment was not over, not for him, not yet. Ethan did not rush, and that alone was unusual, because in every other situation he moved with precision and speed, decisions made in seconds, actions following immediately after. But this time he slowed down, not because he was unsure, but because he was aware of something he had missed, something he had underestimated. And awareness has a way of changing the way a man moves. Naomi Brooks had just placed the last tray on the service counter, her hand steady, her focus already shifting to the next task, because for her, the night was not defined by one moment. It was defined by responsibility, by routine, by showing up and doing the work whether anyone noticed or not. She turned slightly, preparing to step back into the quiet rhythm of the staff area. And that was when she heard his voice, not loud, not commanding, just direct. "Naomi," he said, and the sound of her name in his voice felt different, not because of how it was spoken, but because he had taken the time to learn it. She paused, just for a second, then turned, meeting his gaze without hesitation, without surprise, just present, the same way she had been all night. Ethan stood a few feet away, no longer behind a table, no longer framed by contracts and executives, just a man in a suit standing in front of someone he had overlooked. And for a brief moment, there was no script for this, no negotiation strategy, no prepared line, just a space that required something real, something he did not often need to offer. "You were right," he said finally, his tone even, but the weight behind it clear, not a performance, not a formality, but an acknowledgement. And Naomi did not react the way most people might have expected. She did not smile. She did not soften. She did not step forward into the recognition. She simply nodded once, as if the truth did not need celebration, only acceptance. And that response lingered, because it was not what Ethan was used to. In his world, value was often followed by reward, recognition, leverage. But here, there was none of that, just quiet certainty. "How did you catch it?" he asked, not out of doubt, but out of curiosity. The kind that comes when something challenges your understanding of how things work. Naomi's eyes held steady, her answer simple. "I was paying attention." And those 4 words landed deeper than any explanation filled with credentials ever could, because they exposed something he had overlooked, not just in the document, but in himself. Attention, not intelligence, not resources, not experience, but attention, the willingness to truly see what is in front of you. And in that moment, Ethan understood that the mistake had not been in the numbers alone. It had been in the way he chose to move through the room, who he chose to notice, who he chose to ignore. "You should not be here," he said, the sentence coming out before he could refine it. But Naomi did not flinch. She understood what he meant, not dismissal, but recognition of misplaced value. "I am exactly where I need to be," she replied, calm, grounded, not defensive, just certain. And that answer stayed with him, because it was not about position. It was about perspective, about knowing your worth even when the room does not reflect it back to you. Around them, the staff continued working, the soft sounds of closing routines filling the space. But the moment between them remained still, focused, and Ethan realized something he had not considered before, that influence is not always held by the person at the head of the table. Sometimes it belongs to the one who sees what everyone else misses. And as he stood there, no longer rushing, no longer assuming, one thing became clear in a way it had not been before. This was not just a correction, not just a moment of insight. It was a shift, and he was only beginning to understand what that shift would cost him and what it might change. The space between them did not feel like a gap anymore. It felt like a line that had been crossed, quietly but permanently. And Ethan Caldwell was not a man who ignored lines once he saw them. He studied Naomi for a moment longer, not in the way he used to observe people, measuring their status or their usefulness, but differently now, as if trying to understand something he had never needed to before, something that did not fit into numbers or contracts. "Where did you learn to read financial models like that?" he asked, his voice steady but no longer distant, and Naomi shifted her weight slightly, the tray now resting against the counter, her hands free, her posture unchanged. "I used to study finance," she said, simple, direct, no embellishment, and that answer opened a door he had not expected. "Used to?" He followed, and there was no pressure in the question, just curiosity, the kind that comes when the story in front of you does not match the assumptions you made. Naomi held his gaze for a second, then answered without hesitation, "Life changed." And that was all. No explanation about tuition, no mention of long nights or responsibilities, no list of reasons. Just 2 words that carried more weight than a full story ever could. Because sometimes what is not said is what matters most. Ethan nodded slightly, not because he understood everything, but because he understood enough. Enough to recognize that the room he had just left was not the only place where value existed. It was just the only place that decided who got seen. And that realization settled into him with a quiet clarity. "You caught something my entire team missed," he said, not as a compliment, but as a fact, and Naomi did not step into that either. She did not take ownership of the moment the way most would. "They were focused on proving the deal works," she replied, her tone calm, almost reflective. "I was just looking to see if it actually did." And there it was again, that difference, not louder, not smarter, just more honest, more grounded. And Ethan felt that distinction land in a way he could not ignore, because in his world, focus was everything, but it had always been directed toward outcomes, toward winning, toward closing. And in that focus, something had been lost, something simple, something essential. The question of whether the foundation itself was correct. The room behind them continued to empty, the soft echo of footsteps and distant voices fading into the background. But neither of them moved right away, because the moment had not finished unfolding yet. "You should come work for me," Ethan said, the offer direct, instinctive. The way he solved problems, identify value, bring it closer, make it part of the system. But Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she was surprised, but because she was considering something deeper than the words. themselves. Her eyes did not light up. Her posture did not shift. She simply stood there, grounded in a way that did not depend on opportunity. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, unchanged. Why? She asked, not challenging, not skeptical, just clear. And that single word stopped Ethan more than any rejection could have, because he had never been asked that before, not like this. Not in a way that required him to think beyond the obvious, beyond salary, beyond position, beyond the usual language of power. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan Caldwell did not have an immediate answer, because what she was really asking was not what he could offer her, but what had changed, and whether he even understood it himself. The question did not echo loudly, but it stayed, hanging in the space between them with a weight that Ethan Caldwell could not ignore, because it was not a question about opportunity, it was a question about intention, and intention was something he had never needed to explain before, especially not to someone he had only just begun to truly see. He exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but because for the first time in a long time, he was thinking before speaking, not calculating, not negotiating, just thinking. Because you see things others miss, he said finally, his voice steady, but even as the words left him, he knew they were incomplete. Naomi's expression did not change, not impressed, not convinced, just listening, waiting, and that silence asked for more, not louder, not longer, just deeper. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly, as if searching for something beyond the room, beyond the moment, then returned to her, clearer now, more grounded. And because I missed it, he added, the admission simple, but not easy. It was not about the mistake on the page. It was about the pattern behind it. The habit of overlooking what did not demand attention. The assumption that value always announces itself. And Naomi heard that. Not just the words, but what they carried, the awareness behind them. And for a brief moment, something softened in her eyes. Not acceptance, not agreement. Just recognition that he was beginning to understand something real. You did not miss it, she said quietly. You chose not to look. And that distinction settled into him with precision, because it removed the comfort of accident. It replaced it with responsibility. And responsibility does not fade as easily. Ethan nodded once, not defensively, not dismissively, just acknowledging the truth as it was, not as he might prefer it to be, around them. The room was nearly empty now, the polished silence returning, but the energy had shifted, not outwardly, but internally, in him, in the way he was processing something he could not reduce to a number or a strategy. Then I am choosing differently now, he said, and this time there was no rush in his voice, no need to secure an answer, just a statement, a decision forming in real time. Naomi studied him for a moment, not as a CEO, not as a man with influence, but simply as someone standing in front of her, trying to redefine something he had taken for granted, and she could see the difference, subtle but present, the absence of assumption, the presence of attention, and that mattered more than any offer ever could. Choosing differently is not a moment, she replied, her tone calm, measured. It is a pattern. And once again, her words did not challenge him. They clarified something he had not yet fully considered, because change, real change, is not proven in a single decision. It is proven over time, in consistency, in action, in whether the awareness he felt right now would still exist when the room filled again, when pressure returned, when old habits would be easier than new ones. Ethan absorbed that, not as a criticism, but as a standard, and for the first time, the offer he had made felt less like a solution and more like a beginning, something that required more than agreement, more than acceptance. It required understanding, and Naomi did not move toward that understanding. She did not reach for the opportunity or step away from it. She simply stood there, grounded in her own clarity, and in that moment, Ethan realized that what he was offering was not what she was evaluating. She was not deciding whether to work for him. She was deciding whether he was worth working with. And that shift, quiet but undeniable, changed everything. The room had gone quiet in a way that no one would remember tomorrow, but both of them would, because some silences are not about what is said, they are about what changes, and Ethan Caldwell stood there, no longer measuring the moment by what he could gain, but by what he had just learned, not from a boardroom, not from a report, but from a woman he had almost erased from the night entirely. Naomi Brooks did not move toward him, and she did not step away. She simply held her ground, the same way she had held it when no one was watching. And that consistency mattered more than anything he could offer, because it proved something he had never questioned before. That value does not appear when it is acknowledged. It exists whether it is seen or not. Ethan let that settle, not rushing to fill the space with another offer, another explanation, because for the first time, he understood that this was not a negotiation. It was a reflection, and reflections are not controlled. They are faced. You are right, he said quietly, not repeating the words for effect, but because they had taken on a different meaning now. Not about the numbers, not about the deal, but about the way he had moved through the room, the way he had defined importance, and Naomi heard that, not as a victory, not as a shift in power, but as a step, small but real, and she nodded once, not granting approval, just acknowledging that he had reached a point he had not been at before. The soft hum of the building continued around them, distant footsteps, the quiet closing of doors, the kind of sounds that signal an ending. But this did not feel like one. It felt like something unfinished, something still forming. Ethan glanced briefly toward the empty table, the unsigned contract, the deal that would now take longer, require more effort, more scrutiny, and yet, for the first time that night, that did not feel like a loss. It felt like a correction, and he turned back to her. No longer seeing a role, no longer seeing a position, just seeing her, clearly, fully, without assumption. If you ever decide you want something different, he said, his tone steady, not persuasive, not forceful, just open. You will have the option. And that was different from before, because it was not an offer built on taking. It was an acknowledgement built on respect. Naomi considered that for a moment, not because she needed it, but because she understood what it represented, not opportunity, but awareness. And awareness, when it is real, changes more than circumstance. It changes direction. Options are only valuable if they come with understanding. She replied, her voice calm, her words precise, and Ethan nodded again, because now he understood that this was not about convincing her. It was about becoming someone worth choosing, and that was not something he could prove in a single conversation. It would take time, consistency, attention, the very things he had overlooked before. Naomi picked up her tray once more, the movement simple, natural, as if the moment had already passed for her, because in many ways, it had. She had done what she needed to do, said what needed to be said, and now she moved forward, not waiting for recognition, not holding on to the shift that had just occurred, because her value was never dependent on whether someone else saw it. And as she walked away, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, watching her go, not with regret, but with clarity, because he understood something now that no contract had ever taught him. That power can fill a room, but awareness defines it. And that night, in a room built for influence, the most important voice had not been the loudest one. It had been the one no one thought to hear, until it was almost too late.